Hey viewers, now recently, John Cedars, who is the creator of jwsurvey.com, or it might be .org, he's the atheist who is a former Jehovah's Witness. He recently released a video that was entitled, His Top 10 Immoral Verses from the Bible, though all of them were from the Old Testament. But, as some people in his own comment section asked, I've made a video which explains 1 through 10. It essentially explains the scriptures that he brought up. I'm going to get right into this. I don't want this video to be too long. Alright, the first scripture he brought up was Genesis 19, verses 6 through 8. During these verses, I won't read them so the video won't be too long. Lot was visited by angels, and during these particular verses, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah wanted to have intercourse with these angels. So Lot said, well, I will send out my daughters, and you guys can basically gang rape them to protect the angels. However, there are a few things that John Cedars didn't keep in mind. Well, for one thing, Lot didn't have good decision making. He looked at Sodom and Gomorrah and saw that it was beautiful because, to give you a little bit of a context into the situation, Abraham offered Lot a choice. He said, I will go this way and you will go the other way. We have too many servants, we have too many cattle, and we have to split ways. So he gave Lot first pick of the land, and Lot happened to choose Sodom and Gomorrah. But rather than send some spies or servants to the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, he just unwisely saw the beauty of it and went right into it. So that was a bad decision, and so offering up his daughters, again, a bad decision, but it really has no reflection on Jehovah's character. It's not as if Jehovah told him, yes, send your daughters out there. It was purely his decision. He also says that if you take the Bible literally, you have to believe that it was a good decision for Lot to prioritize angels. In this particular instance, his decision to offer up his daughters was obviously a bad decision. The second one is from Exodus 20, verses 4 through 6. This is the second point he brought up. And this scripture speaks of a son bearing the burden of his father, or as it says, bringing punishment for the error of fathers upon sons. And some say that this is a contradiction to Ezekiel 18 verse 20, which says that a son himself will bear nothing because of the error of the father. And this information I'm getting, as I'm sure you can see, is from Questions from Readers, The Watchtower 2010. But these scriptures are not contradicting as it says. One statement focuses on the individual's accountability, and that's Ezekiel 18 verse 20. And the other acknowledges the reality that a person's error may have consequences affecting his descendants. The best example of this is a Levite named Korah. During the Israelites' wilderness journey, Korah just wasn't happy with his service privileges, and he didn't think Moses was doing a very good job. However, his sons, the sons of Korah, as you may know, did not support his decision, so when the time came for Korah to get punished, his sons were not among them. Now, I personally, having a shady father figure, have experienced how the error of fathers upon sons can affect the personal life of somebody. That being said, if you read the scriptures, it clearly shows that Ezekiel 18:20 says, a son himself will bear nothing because of the error of the father. He won't be cursed just to be cursed, but the consequences of his father's mistakes will affect him. Point 3, which was Leviticus 12 verses 1 through 5, which said that if a female has a daughter, she has to be unclean twice as long as if she were to have a male. But having to be considered unclean for more days when a female is born doesn't equate to a male being worth more. And at no point during the Old Testament are men said to be more valuable. At any point. And I've looked into it. And also, seminal emissions, menstruation, childbirth, touching a dead body, and many other things made an Israelite unclean. It was simply something to remind them that they were imperfect, and we are too. Now to point number 4. Leviticus 25 verses 44 to 55. Those were pertaining to slavery. But you have to keep in mind that slavery was common back then, and Israelite slavery was different. Cruelty wasn't allowed, even if the slave wasn't a Hebrew. Now, there was a special arrangement for the Hebrews where theirs was temporary and it couldn't last any longer than 6 years. And every 50 years, all were set free. And other slaves could save up and buy their freedom. If a slave went free, even if not Hebrew, his master wasn't to send him empty-handed, but rather he should be given gifts and rewards. Now, this is something that the nations back then did not practice. Quite a few, if they were born slaves, they would stay slaves from birth to death. They couldn't buy their freedom. If they were to leave, they would leave empty-handed. This was a good arrangement. But, as the Watchtower brings out, some of you may not like the Watchtower, but there are some good references. By the time the Bible began to be written, humans had already established social structures and economic systems that conflicted with godly principles. Already the social structure of slavery had been in that entire structure of people. And so while some of the practices involved were condemned by his written law, Jehovah chose to tolerate that arrangement. Doesn't mean he approved of it, but he tolerated it. The next point, number 5, is Numbers 15 verses 32 to 36. I found this one very interesting. I had to dig a little bit deeper. Now, during this scenario, man was found gathering wood supplies on the Sabbath. So the people gathered him, they detained him, they weren't sure what to do with him. The decision was made by Jehovah to tell the people to stone him. And this may seem cruel, but what you have to realize is the man was to be an example. If he got away with gathering wood supplies on the Sabbath, then other people would work and collect materials on the Sabbath as well. If he only got a warning upon being caught, then others who caught him would insist on giving a warning as well. I mean, the excuses they could make are just, possibly infinite amount of excuses. One could say, I wasn't told about what happened, I was asleep, or, maybe I wasn't clean, I couldn't be around, or I was sick. Any number of excuses. And it may seem brutal, but once again, and this is something you have to keep in mind with the entirety of the Old Testament, that is how things worked in the ancient world. Point number 6, which is taken for Numbers 31 verses 13 through 18. And then, again, ancient world. Now for Numbers 31, 13 through 18, this was during, Moses and Eleazar the priests, all the princes of the congregation. Yes, the Council of Balaam. Now, in this, to give a little bit of context before this happened, the Council of Balaam schemed essentially to get the Israelites to sin against Jehovah, which they did. And they even went so far as to worship pagan gods. So, the command was given to kill essentially everyone, but all of the women, children. But again, and this may be why I forgot to write that down, this was from an ancient world, and that is how they did it. Now there is to be a resurrection of the righteous and unrighteous, so who's to say who will and won't make it? But again, that is how they did things. Point number 7, and I did struggle with this scripture for a few years, but I understood it, I want to say about 9 months ago when I did some research. It's 2 Samuel 6 verses 6 through 7. This spoke of Uzzah grabbing the ark to make it stable. The cattle were freaking out. But if you look up Numbers 4 verse 15, it mentions that touching the ark brought death to everybody, even the high priest. They had to get a cloth because the ark represented what was holy and what was sacred. And humans, as we are, whether you are religious or atheist, I think you can agree that humans, as we are not holy and sacred. So, understandably, Uzzah died. Point number 8. This comes from 2 Samuel 12 verses 13 through 18. During the scripture, Jehovah mentions that he forgave David who, to give you some context, had previously murdered a man and then took his wife, and before murdering him actually slept with him. So he was an adulterer and a murderer. And his child was born in sin. And so there had to be consequences, and that's why the child died. But again, with there being a resurrection, I highly doubt that the child's not going to make it. Point number 9. 2 Kings 2 verses 23 and 24. Now during this scenario, Elijah the prophet was walking up. And it mentions that some children were jeering at him and mocking him, telling him to go up, bald head. Now, some she-bears, 2 she-bears came out and killed over 42 of them. But there's much more to the situation. For one thing, these children were knowingly disrespecting the prophet of Jehovah. Second, you really weren't considered a man in the ancient world until you were at least 20 years of age, especially in Israel. Third, this harassment had been going on for some time, and it mentions 42 of them were killed. That's quite a bit. If 42 of them were killed, who knows how many more were there? This means there was a large crowd of potentially young men who were stalking a prophet of Jehovah. I mean, stalking is not good in any context. But if 42 got killed, just imagine how many of them were essentially stalking him as he went. The last point is 10. And this one comes from Psalm 137, verse 8 and 9. Now here, John Cedars actually admits that the psalm is probably a poem. The psalm speaks of dashing Babylonian children and being happy. That being said, just because the writer wanted Babylonian children to be dashed to pieces does not mean that Jehovah did. Sometimes people forget that even though the Bible is Jehovah's inspired word, there are opinions inserted by the writer that are allowed to be there, but aren't the opinions of Jehovah. As if a secretary writing for his boss, the secretary may insert pieces and parts of his opinion. And this is the exact same scenario. And so those are my 10 reasonings. I'm not sure if I'm going to call this video debunking or what, but just to give some context into these scriptures. But the most important thing to remember is this was an ancient world. Many things they did back then really will not make a lot of sense. They were a little bit closer to perfection, and the Israelites were in a special relationship with Jehovah. So his dealings with them are not at all like his dealings with people in the New Testament, that things had changed. Just to give you some information on that. So saying it was from an ancient world may seem like an excuse, but unfortunately it is a legitimate one. I'm curious to see if John Cedars will make a video on 10 or more verses from the New Testament. Now that's going to be a challenge for him. That book is significantly more modern, being written about 2,000 or so years ago. And being more modern, and by then Jehovah ending his special relationship with the Israelites, and then opening up to the whole world, under no such laws as is found in Exodus, Leviticus. It's going to be significantly harder for him to make a video about 10 immoral things from the New Testament. Not impossible, very difficult. And if that does, I would be surprised, but if that does happen, I'm sure I'll make a video on it. Probably could do that one in my sleep. Alright, thank you for watching. Leave a like, leave a dislike, leave a comment for sure. I'm sure some of you will. And I will see you later. Thank you.